Okay, hi guys. So today's lesson, I think this is now lesson 5 of the attachment topic. So today we're going to be looking at the starting point of explanations of attachment, which basically means how an attachment is formed, what is the actual process of it, and today we're going to be starting that off with looking at something called the learning theory. So to give you a bit of context about the learning theory, so far we've looked at how attachments can be formed looking at caregiver-infant interaction, so the process of reciprocity and interactional synchrony, and we've also looked at the stages of attachment, so that was the Schaffer and Emerson work on what ages and what stages they go through and they form their attachments. But one of the issues with those two sort of subtopics was that a lot of the research was very kind of descriptive and not very explanatory. So it sort of said reciprocity and interactional synchrony take place and they happen, and it can be very easily observed that those behaviours happen, but it didn't really explain how they happen and why they happen. So the explanations of attachment sort of subtopic is looking into more detail about the physical process that babies and their mothers or their caregivers go through to actually form this bond and how the attachment can be explained. So, the learning theory, some of you might recognise the word learning theory from when we did ages ago the approaches topic. So, within the approaches topic, there were sort of a learning theory, and that was the behaviourist approach. So, some psychologists actually still refer to the behaviourist approach as the learning theory. So, it does link heavily. It's basically the exact same theory. Any learning theory is a behaviourist kind of assumption or type of theory. So what I would like you to do to start off with is jot down in a sort of mind map similar to the one I've got here anything that you can remember about the behaviourist approach from when we did it at the start of the year. So the main assumptions, the main features, the main types of research methods, so how they gather their data, anything that you can remember about the behaviourist approach. It might be the key psychologists that you remember, their key bits of research or their studies, anything you can remember. Okay, so just spend about 5 to 10 minutes recapping and refreshing on that. Okay, so hopefully you came up with some good ideas. So the sorts of things I was sort of looking for you to remember about the behaviourist approach is that all behaviour is learned. Okay, that is why it's called learning theory. So they are completely suggesting that anything that we do as a human, including as a baby and including attachment behaviour, is learnt from our environment. And there are two different ways that that is learnt from our environment, and that is classical and operant conditioning. So hopefully some of you wrote that down, or if I'm saying it now, it's kind of coming back to you in your memories of the behaviourist approach. And also this idea of the blank slate. So when we looked at the behaviourist approach, there was kind of this tabula rasa, we're born a blank slate, nothing is inherited, nothing is passed on through nature, we are just learning to behave in a particular way due to our experiences from our environment. So it's very much nurture over nature for the behaviourist approach and for learning theory. So in terms of specifically to attachment behaviour, it's thought that attachment is learnt through an association, so very similar to classical conditioning, to a caregiver with the process of feeding. It's also referred to as cupboard love theory, so the mother feeds the baby and the baby learns from that to associate the caregiver with that process. Okay, so starting off again then refreshing with classical conditioning and how that fits in. So in classical conditioning, if you can remember, there were several key terms when you are describing the actual physical process. So think about Pavlov's dogs, think about little Albert, and think about how that might apply to learning theory. So what I want you to do first is to pause the video and go and find out the proper names and the definition for classical conditioning to fill that in and add to your notes. So what is classical conditioning? I want a good definition, a sentence on that. And then what do all of these mean? What do they stand for? Okay, so go find that out first. Okay, now what I'd like to do, I know you've probably watched it loads of times, but this is more to just refresh your memory on it. go to YouTube and type in Pavlov's dogs and click on the first link. And this gives you a really nice summary, an overview of what Pavlov did using classical conditioning with the dogs. So that will just refresh your memory, and it's the exact same process but just applied to an attachment learning behaviour. Okay, so do that next. Okay, now what I would like you to think about, you don't have to write anything down yet, but what I'd like you to have in your mind, how the components from Pavlov's dogs that you've just watched would play in the formation of a positive association with an infant and their caregiver with the use of food. So in Pavlov's dogs, he's got the use of food, but it's to learn when the food's coming, and it creates like a response of salivation because there's an association between when they ring the bell and the food and then the saliva. So I'm thinking, how can you now use those little components, those key terms, into creating an association with an infant and their caregiver? So just have a little think about that, but you don't have to write it down yet. So using food, you've got the food up here, so the milk, and you've got the caregiver, and you've got the baby. So before classical conditioning takes place, so this is before the attachment process is beginning, this is before any learning has taken place, so pre-conditioning, you've got the food, and that makes the baby satisfied. The baby's happy because it's being fed, so that is a natural sort of instinct. And then you've got the caregiver by herself, not really causing any sort of response from the baby, because again, as I said, the attachment hasn't yet been formed. So according to learning theory, the baby yet wouldn't associate that with anything. It's just a human there. It's probably doesn't even recognise that it's its mother, but it does recognise, the feeling of hunger being suppressed and satisfying hunger. So that's why that provokes the normal, nice feeling. So have a think about that. Okay, so the conditioning process itself then. So you've got step 1, the food, creating a nice, smiley, happy baby. You've then got the mother and the food, still creating a nice, happy baby. At this point, probably still reacting to the food. This stage would be repeated, so the mother would feed the baby over and over and over again until eventually you've got the mother now provoking the happy baby as well. So hopefully that's given you a bit of a clue as to what you need to do next. I want you to use these key terms. I want you to draw out this diagram in your notes, and I want you to plot all the key terms in where they would fit. And then once you've done that, I want you to write like a short paragraph just explaining what you've drawn. You can actually get credit for drawing diagrams in an exam, but it's always best to know how you would thoroughly explain it using the key terms as well, because it flows a lot nicer. Okay, so that's what I want you to do next. Okay, the next activity then, I've got just a really straightforward copy the passage and fill in the blanks. So this is basically what I just asked you to do with that paragraph. Your paragraph should be something similar to this with all of these kind of things filled in. So do that now. Okay, so someone called Sears believed that they kind of knew the purpose of why the baby would form such a strong attachment to the caregiver, the one that feeds them. And this is because he claimed that food is something called a primary drive, meaning that because hunger is something that's innate and crucial for survival, the food, and that is the kind of main drive of that behaviour. So due to the fact that the caregivers are providing the baby with the food, so the primary drive, the association of food and sort of the pleasure of receiving food then kind of generalizes or rubs off onto the caregiver, and the attachment is then formed as the secondary drive. So some psychologists think that having an attachment is sort of the main survival instinct, and that having the attachment itself is a primary drive, but Sears was arguing that it's actually food is the primary drive. Because the caregiver provides the primary drive, the attachment is formed as a secondary kind of attachment. Okay. Okay, so next bit, operant conditioning. So again, you should hopefully remember a little bit about operant conditioning. So the first thing for this, I want you to find out and write definitions for operant conditioning, positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, and punishment. And then I want you to have a little think about, but not, you don't have to write it down yet. Think about how these could be applied to the learning theory of attachment as well. So how could you use punishment? How could you use reward, etc., to help a bond? This is still using food as the kind of primary drive in this kind of process. If you're struggling to remember, again, go to YouTube and type in operant conditioning and click on the first link to refresh your memory on that one. So you can do all of these tasks now. Okay, so a little recap then. So any behaviour that produces a reward is positive reinforcement. So you probably all remembered that one. That's probably the easier one of the terms to remember. So something's going to be likely to be repeated if there's a reward at the end of it. So, for example, if a baby cries and gets a cuddle afterwards, it teaches them to cry again because they know that they're going to get a nice cuddle afterwards. So that's the positive reinforcement. Behaviours that lead to the avoidance of something unpleasant happening, that is negative reinforcement. That's the one that people always struggle to remember. We're going to look at that one in a bit more detail because that one's a little bit more complicated. It's not necessarily the baby that's involved in the negative reinforcement aspect. It's actually more the mother that plays that role. So we're going to look at that in a second. And then you've got behaviours that lead to an unpleasant outcome are less likely to repeat it. So that's punishment. So if a baby cries and nothing happens, then obviously that's like a punishment because there's no reward. So then the baby eventually will learn that, if it cries, it's not going to get anything. So therefore the behaviour stops being repeated. So he stops crying because he knows he's not going to get any reward. So where the negative reinforcement fits in, so you've got the kind of easy positive reinforcement one. So the baby cries, it gets a cuddle, so it's likely to cry again because it knows it will get a cuddle, positive reinforcement. The negative reinforcement, this is for the mother. So remember, an attachment is a two-way bond. So it's not always the baby that's learning to attach. It's also the mother that's building her bond with her baby as well. So that's why this one is a little bit confusing. So basically, if you've got the baby crying, the mum goes to cuddle the baby. That acts as positive reinforcement for the baby, but it also acts as negative reinforcement for the mother because by cuddling the baby, it kind of avoids the unpleasant outcome of the baby crying because the baby will stop crying. So the mother will therefore continue to cuddle the baby, so her behaviour will be reinforced because it avoids the outcome of the baby crying, which is the unpleasant outcome. Okay, so hopefully that kind of makes a bit more sense. And then you've got the one I talked about before with the baby crying and the mother not responding. They'll see that as punishment, so they'll not do that behaviour in the future. So all of these kind of theories, you can kind of see how much of a practical application these have to parenting. It's kind of an age-old thing about, I'll never pick up a crying baby, or you shouldn't go to a baby every time it cries because it will learn to keep crying because it knows you're gonna come and cuddle it and all of that stuff. So this has a really kind of loads of practical applications, so you can use that when you're evaluating this theory. You've also got social learning theory. So if you remember when we looked at the approaches, social learning theory was actually kind of a part of or an add-on to the learning theory or behaviourist approach. It was very similar, but it's suggesting, and obviously this was by Bandura, suggesting that we can also learn through observation. So if children are observing their parents' behaviour with each other, so let's say you've got a strong relationship from the mother and the father, the children will witness that and they'll observe it, and they will then kind of imitate that behaviour. And you've also got the parents sort of instructing and having an influence on their children about relationships and about appropriate behaviour, and a lot of parents will have the kind of reward and punishment type systems for behaviour in their houses as well. So attachment is kind of learnt through a lot of that and influence from parents as well. Okay, so we're going to pause to do a little question now. So this is an application style question using your knowledge of learning theory. So Claudia hears her baby crying, so she goes to see if it needs feeding. The baby sees Claudia coming and immediately stops crying. Using your knowledge of learning theory and attachment, explain why the baby might have learnt to stop crying when he sees Claudia, and that is 4 marks. Make sure you use all the key terms, so go into a good amount of detail about all those key terms. Don't just shorten them, make sure you write them in full at least once, and that should take you about 5 minutes. Okay, so pause the video now and have a little go at that question using what we've learnt so far. Okay, the last little bit then is obviously the strengths and weaknesses. It is incredibly difficult to go through evaluation with you remotely in terms of thinking of new ways to go through evaluation, because obviously you're not there, so I can't ask you questions. So a lot of the evaluation, you'll have noticed that I am kind of just providing you with it, which is fine, but I am going to provide you with like a bare minimum of the evaluation, and then I will ask that you guys elaborate on it in your own way using that peel format. So I'm kind of going to give you the main gist of the evaluative points, but not the whole thing. So then I'm going to get you to elaborate on them yourselves. So you've got lots of research to support learning theory. So you've got things like Pavlov's dogs, Skinner's rats, Little Albert. All of those studies are obviously very reputable, very scientific, and therefore adding credibility to learning theory of attachment, because even though they are demonstrating classical and operant conditioning in a different way, they are ultimately the same. So any research to do with that will link to that. Another bit of support is that Dollard and Miller found that babies are fed approximately 2,000 times in the first year, and this is generally by their mother. So can you imagine if it was something to do with classical conditioning, if they're being fed 2,000 times, chances are a strong association is eventually going to be made after all of those repetitions of the mother plus the food and the happy baby. Okay, so think about how you might elaborate on that. Weaknesses then, so Shaffer and Emerson, so these are the psychologists that we looked at for stages of attachment. They found that it's not always the person that feeds the baby that becomes the primary attachment, so that kind of contradicts the theory. You've also got, from when we looked at animal studies, that Harlow and Harlow demonstrated that actually the monkeys preferred the mother that was comfortable and warm over the one that provided the food. So again, it kind of contradicts and criticises the idea that if an attachment was solely based on the providing of food and the association with food, then why is it that the monkeys preferred the cloth mother and not the one that provided the food? Okay, so have a think about those. And then the last one, a lot of psychologists argue that there are more innate sort of biological inbuilt factors that contribute to the formation of attachment as opposed to the environment. So learning theory is all about, being born a blank slate, but a lot of psychologists, so for example John Bowlby, when we come to look at that next lesson, he claims that a lot of attachment is instinctive. It's in our nature to form an attachment to survive, so it's got nothing to do with this kind of learning from our experiences. So from all of those, I want you to elaborate at least 2 strengths and 2 weaknesses. So point, evidence or example, elaboration, and then link back to theory. So I've probably given you the point and a little bit of evidence. So I want you to elaborate on that or give another example and then link it back to what that point would suggest about the learning theory. Does it suggest it's valid? Does it suggest it's not very good? Does it suggest it's reductionist or simplistic, or that more work needs to be done, etc.? Okay, so 4 of those paragraphs. And then finally, your task is to create an A4 revision poster of learning theory, so putting everything together on one piece of A4. You can do this digitally if you want, using reliable resources. So the attachment booklet that I showed you how to get from Godalming Online, you can use that. And a top tip for you, you can also use your approaches booklet from the start of the first year to get good information from the behaviourist approach, because again it is largely the same theory, just applying more specifically to attachment. So you could probably get the bulk of your notes from your approaches booklet if you need to. So it has to include both AO1 and AO3, diagrams, pictures where appropriate, make them look really nice, so include classical and operant conditioning, all the key terms, and some evaluation as well. And once you've done that, I want you to submit that to the assignment that I'm going to put on Teams, which is going to be titled Learning Theory. And again, that's going to be the same deadline as normal, Sunday night, 8 p.m. On the 17th. Okay, that's it for today.